quickly, whereas the institutional groups might not have moved, or might have moved much more slowly or much more conservatively. But because these other peoples are always talking about them, knocking on their doors, talking to the newspapers, talking to the media, being critical of them, I think that there is greater movement on the institutional groups. So the MAC is unique in that it's made up of some of the most conservative groups in Canada and some of the most radical groups in Canada. They all come together, and you can imagine what happens when they all come together in Toronto at one meeting. At that last meeting, Ms. McGill spoke. She was one of the commissioners on the report, and not the last one, the one before that, the 72 one, and also Florence Bird spoke. And the commission, I have a report of the commission itself. It gets involved in the most radical issues in the most radical way. But whether you approve of it or not, whether you want to belong to it or not, some of our graduates belong to it who are living here in Halifax. Voice of Women belongs to it. Some other groups, CWL is out of it now. Anyway, the point would be that it is a group that will bring about change. Now, as I said, they will have a lot of opposition. But perhaps the key thing they do, I don't know how articulate I am being about trying to express this to you. I think the key thing they do is make the institutional groups change. In other words, they themselves may not be able to bring about their own change because there are too many people who are opposed to them and won't listen to them. But the kind of raising of consciousness they do and the kind of changing they do so affects the other groups and the general population that the other groups, which might have looked radical, look conservative by comparison. So things get passed by the general population because the NAC, which seems sensible, which without the NAC would have seemed radical. Does that make sense to you? Kind of thing I'm saying. And that happens not just about women's groups, that happens about all groups. I'm sure people like Larry Fisk will be able to do much more than this with you in terms of political science and how you bring about change. So that's the National Action Committee and the Laura Sabi report. If there should be any time at the end of this session, I would like to speak to you about the Indian question and the Supreme Court decision, because the NAC group had a meeting just last week in Toronto to discuss this, and I was talking about it with them later in Montreal. And I think you should be aware of this particular action because it's an immediate, important thing for all of us. Now, in addition to the National Action Group, there's a group which is the Women in the University. It's actually a very loose organization. It doesn't belong to any particular group. Everybody's looking around. Somebody's going to call out when it's time for me to stop, okay? All right. All right, the Women in the University group is an ad hoc group of the university women, and it meets with the learned societies once a year. It has no money, it has no officers, it has nothing, but it still managed to meet now for 2 years, 3 years, and I presume it's going to meet next year at Toronto. And again, I think its value is in its very looseness and its casualness, that it can bring up issues without having to get them to go through boards or committees or anything else. They can just talk from where they are and then come up with conclusions and bring that into their university committees. So like the NAC, and yet a little bit different, this Committee on University Women, which meets with the learned societies, I think has its own value. Again, we don't always see alike, but that doesn't mean that I don't think it has its own particular value. 2 other committees I'm going to talk about. The AUCC committee, which I would like to spend some time on because that is the committee that I was responsible in creating, and the CAUT committee. The AUCC is the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada. It's the national organization for universities. Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada. That committee I want to talk about. The CAUT committee, which is the Canadian Association of University Teachers, I can't tell you very much about, but most of our faculty members are members of the CAUT. We have a local organization on it, and Elaine Murphy has been elected to the National Committee on Women of the CAUT. So if I stop here and then pick up at the AUCC so I can spend some time on it.